Civil War roundtable about his wound. Yeah, that was when I was living up in New York State.
We'll grab you a couple of waters.
Oh, okay,
And
thank
I've
you.
got you two microphones just in case.
Right.
This one's red,
Yeah,
so that's
yeah.
the battery's dead.
For this like the traffic circle here around noon. I'm going to write a letter to DOT and send a copy to the Pinehurst Council. They're not going to do anything, before the U.S. Open next year, but there are some things they really should do that they could complete in a week or less. The 15501 heading south, that entrance, and the entrance into the circle. That's probably the main one. The Route 2 entrance coming from Southern Pines is a little bit less critical. A traffic circle today, well, the small circles are good examples of what a traffic circle should be like today. Up north where I lived, they took a 1.5 mile stretch of road that had three major intersecting roads in that 1.5 miles, and it was a 4-lane highway, but there were two traffic lights, and in the winter in particular, when there was snow on the ground, you would have backups for about a mile because it would take cars a while to get traction and start moving, so traffic was moving slow, and then because it was such a long light, people would enter the intersection on the caution, basically blocking the cross traffic. Yeah, so no one went anywhere. So what the state did was to put in 4 double loop circles in 1.5 miles, and they sent out before the circles opened. They sent out letters to all the people in the surrounding area about how to drive a double circle. In a double circle, you basically have a 4-lane highway entering the double circle, and it took a little while, but once people got used to a double circle, then there never was a hang up there, even in the winter. But the thing is this circle here, which is one of the big problems. But they're not going to change that in the sense that I think the town of Pinehurst is resistant to any major change. But the two things that could be done, and actually should be done before the U.S. Open, most of us down here, I would say the average age of the population down here, it's been dropping down, but several years ago it used to be 73. Now it's probably 69 with the Bragg people, living in the area. You're seeing more kids and things like that. But if you're heading south on 15501, you will notice that at least half of the cars lay back from the entrance of the circle a good 100 feet or so, and that's because us older folks, can only turn our heads that far around. So you lay back so you can see, but because you're 100 feet from the entrance to the circle, you need a bigger time gap, the bigger space gap. And if you creep up to the entrance point, looking for an opening, then you have to really crane your, and that's a major problem. 1952, when the circle was put in, that was not a problem. That was basically a merge lane. But it's not a merge lane. It's an entrance to a circle. So what they need to do is instead of that sharp entrance, they just need to create a new entrance. They can put it right alongside the flower bed, so it's almost a right angle. When you come up to a right angle, then it's just like coming out of your driveway or coming out of any cross street. You don't have to crane your neck all the way around to see if traffic's coming in. And so they could basically just make that less of a steep angle there, and the other entrance would be from Route 2, head from Southern Pines. The 211 entrance is a right angle. The 15501 heading south is basically a right angle. I mean, just the orientation of the roads there is such that you don't have to do anything to those entrances. So that would be the first thing that should be done. The second thing that should be done, and a woman had suggested this, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, in a letter to the pilot, and I thought it was brilliant. The Route 2 entrance, both the entrance and exit, Route 2, heading into Pinehurst. Now, they should eliminate that as an exit, okay? And they should make that a double lane from 211. About half the traffic on 211 is going to go south as it comes into the circle. So by eliminating that exit there and just paving, you can finish the paving around to 15501 heading south. What people do now is, if there's a long line on 211, they'll take the loop around onto Route 2, drive down to the second exit, because the second crossover, and then get into the Pinehurst one and go around. So already people are bypassing that, and at rush hours, at the hospital shift change, a lot of cars are doing that. Just eliminate that as an exit off the circle to allow that right-hand lane from 211 to come in there and go right around and head on 15501 south. Now you say, well, what about the people that go to, Pinehurst 6 there? You get off at the road that comes out of the hospital complex. What is that road there? Page. The first, when you enter Page Road, the first left-hand turn used to be a two-way street. It's a one-way street to prevent people from basically bypassing it. That was used, I'm certain, as a bypass by many people to avoid the long line on 211. The people in the neighborhood probably complained to the town about it, so the town made that one-way onto Page Road. So you can't bypass the circle by using that. Well, you make that a two-way street. It already was a two-way street. You make it a two-way street, so anyone who wants to go into lives at number 6, they just take Page Road, hang a left there, and cross over Route 2 into Pinehurst 6. I'm certain people along that route, in particular during the U.S. Open, all those $1 million homes along there, I'm certain they would be delighted not to have a lot of traffic goes by their homes during that period of time. And for the slight inconvenience of taking Page Road into 6, they could basically unload 211. Most of the traffic coming into the area is going to come in from the west. The heavy traffic from Charlotte is going to come in that way. And if you have a quick access to 15501 south, that'll make traffic flow there much easier. That they could do just with with barriers, temporary barriers. That should be done for the U.S. Open. You would have to pave a portion of the flower bed between the exit onto Route 2 and the entrance onto Route 2. But that's a flower bed that should be eliminated anyway because the town plants those nice big tall plants there. So if you're coming into the circle from Route 2, you can't see anything anyway. Yes. and that's a short gap there because people coming on, entering from 211, the gap there time-wise and space-wise is shorter, so that people who are on the Route 2 entrance to the circle and the 211 entrance to the circle, people stuck on the Route 2 entrance they're looking for a bigger gap, but they're not going to see a bigger gap because cars are constantly coming in from 211. So just yeah. Yeah. And realistically, right now, it looks like DOT is not going to do anything for probably the next 8 years. So this would be a temporary solution. It would also give it doesn't disrupt the circle. The circle still maintains its National Park Service because all you're doing is straightening out two angles and putting up a partial loop, eliminating an exit. So you basically maintain the structure of the circle and let people get used to that type of thing. But I think ultimately, if they want to maintain the circle, ultimately they're going to have to make it a double circle. That would be the most logical thing to do. But when I first came down here, I said the obvious solution was a double circle. Then I saw how people drive down here, and I said, you'll never be able to educate the elderly population down here how to drive a double circle. Yeah. Yeah. And that'll disrupt that'll disrupt a lot of people's vision of the circle, and the Park Service may object to that. Those are logical solutions, but I think down here they're not going to fly. When DOT published their proposal, I couldn't. I'm used to driving double circles. I couldn't understand their proposal with feeder circles. Yeah, they quickly took that off the table. Oh yeah. Yeah, that was 30,000 officers permanent. Yep. I've got Walker Station in my backyard. And Walker Station, I would say, is 80% military. Yeah. I belonged to Sacred Heart Church when first came down here. The church was probably about half filled on Sunday, and again, if you saw someone under 40 years of age, it was unique. Now the church is packed, and it's a much younger congregation now. Yep. Got lots of families. These are some of my northern round. I was editor of my northern roundtable for about 20 years. So. In the civil, I guess I've always been kind of interested in military history, but probably the seminal event for me was when I was about 10 years old. my father took the family down to Washington, D.C. for a week. I was living up in central New York State, Utica. Uh, and so we went to Washington for a week. And on the way back, we stopped at Gettysburg. And I read a book about Gettysburg. If you talk to people who visit Gettysburg, it's almost like a semi-mystical experience that many people have when they go there. And there were no park guides back then. That's in 1951. There were no park guides back then, or if there were, we never saw them. But I had read about Pickett's Charge, and we stopped at the high water mark there, and stood where Cushing's battery was. And you put your hand on one of the cannon there, and you just try and imagine what happened there, and that just got me hooked. When I went to college, I put all that stuff aside, became a physician. Then in 1986, my wife had an opportunity. She worked when I was in medical school. She helped put me through medical school. So in 1986, she was a physical therapy educator. She had an opportunity to work at headquarters for the American Physical Therapy Association in Alexandria, Virginia. So we talked about it, and this was a great opportunity for her. So I said, go for it. So she was living down in Washington, in Alexandria. I was now practicing in Albany. We did this for 12 years. So I would see her about every 3 to 6 weeks for a long weekend. I was on call every third weekend. There were 3 of us in our practice. And you couldn't have a pediatrician come to practice. You had to have a pediatric cardiologist come to practice. So on one of those trips down, she said, I drive down on a Thursday night, and on Friday she said, why don't we visit a battlefield, Civil War battlefield? You were interested in Civil War when you were younger. So we visited Manassas, and I got back that weekend, and just reading the local newspaper, discovered that the Capitalistic Civil War Roundtable was meeting in the library of the town where we lived. So I went to one of their meetings, joined, and that's, that rekindled it. I try and find topics to talk about that are not commonly known. Yeah. 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 The American Battlefield Trust, which used to be originally it was the Association, APCWS, the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites. It's a national organization to raise money to buy battle land, and then once they acquire it, they'll deed it over to the Park Service that's associated with that battlefield. So they became the Civil War Preservation Trust, and they united with another organization, and then that became just the Civil War Trust. And then about 5 years ago, they also expanded into preserving battle sites in the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. So now it's just the American Battlefield Trust. And that's my Northern Roundtable. We hit upon selling commemorative envelopes as a way to raise money when that set of that 20 stamp set came out in 1995. And so my Northern Roundtable has raised and donated about $220,000 in actual money to the Preservation Trust, and that's they have access now that there are $5 million each year of federal funds for the purchase of land. And then there's also, often in particular, like Virginia, there are state funds, and then there are wealthy private donors. So many of the things my Northern Roundtable donated money to was matched with funds from these other organizations. So in leveraged funds, we've donated about $2.25 million worth of money as a Civil War roundtable, and that's about 100 people. That's all. So that's I got very much involved in that. That's why I have all those envelopes that I sometimes will circulate around. The trust had an article about a year ago. U.S. News and World Report comes out every year with that issue that looks at colleges and universities. Of the top 70 colleges and universities in the United States, to get a degree, graduate with a bachelor's degree in history, of the top 70, there's 50 of them. You do not need to take an American history course in college to get a degree in history from a university in the United States. You could take history of the South Pacific, history of Japan, history of China, history of Europe, but you don't need to take an American history course to graduate. In New York State, Civil War history was reduced to 2 days in a week. That covers Civil War history. And I like to quote Bernard DeVoto, who's he's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, and I'll use this quote a lot in my talks. He says that the Civil War is the crux of our history. You cannot understand any part of our history from the first day of the Constitutional Convention down to this morning without arriving back at the Civil War. And it's an interesting statement because the Civil War is about 8 years after the Constitutional Convention. But he goes on to explain that to have a Constitutional Convention and to unite the colonies, Adams had to take the issue of slavery and just can it, basically kick it down the road, or else the southern colonies were not going to be interested in the Constitution. That's why we had the 3/5 rule for representatives in the House. And he goes on to explain that it's the Civil War that changes all that. Little things like if you read stuff about the colonies, or even the United States after the Constitutional Convention, prior to the Civil War, it's often referred to as these United States. These with a small u, and a small s. Post Civil War, we begin to perceive ourselves as the United States. Big U, big S. That's a profound change in thought. Yeah. When you begin to think of, when the country begins to think of itself that way, that's probably one of the most profound changes that actually occurs, on a subconscious level. When I talk about Civil War medicine, the concept of going to the hospital when you're ill is a post-Civil War concept. Prior to the Civil War, only poor people went to hospitals. If you were ill, the doctor came to your house, and if you needed care, a female relative took care of you. But you would never go to the hospital because only the indigent went there. But during the war, 2 million soldiers in the Union will be treated in hospitals throughout the United States, mostly in the Northeast, with an overall mortality of only 10%. And when they go home with the concept of you go to the hospital to get better. If you're having chest pain, you say, call a doctor up and have them come to my house. Yeah, sure. You go to the ER. So that's a change in philosophy. We talk about the lack of cleanliness during the Civil War, but and disease would kill 2/3 of the death when the Civil War occurred due to disease, not the war itself. But we tend to think of the camps in the Civil War as the cesspools where disease was. But every city in the United States, people emptied their bedpans into the streets. You were lucky if you had an outhouse. Your water came from usually a pump, probably about 50 feet from your outhouse, or something like that. So disease was just as rampant in the cities, but it's the post Civil War period. Because the military always knew, the professional army always knew that you dug latrines and you took water from different places where your horses were defecating in the water. You went upstream, and they had to teach the volunteer army that. So post Civil War, the first public health laws in New York City come into existence post Civil War as a result of the Civil War. So our whole concept of medicine changes as a result of that. The Civil War is the only war in which most of the soldiers were literate. They read newspapers, and they wrote a lot of letters and diaries and things like that were uncensored. So we have a sampling of what was going on in the soldiers' minds at the time it was occurring. By the time we move to World War I, the military knows that information can be gleaned from letters by the enemy. So censorship comes into existence in war. So it's the only war where we had a literate population writing letters that were uncensored. Vietnam, all the angry information about Vietnam was written 10 to 20 years after the war. Authors stewed about what happened in the war. With photography comes into it. It existed prior to the Civil War, but it's the Civil War that the public begins to see photographs of dead, bloated soldiers. Up to that point, artists portrayed what was happening on the battlefield, it was rare in art to see even blood imitated on dead soldiers on the ground. So the pictures from Antietam, even though they're to print them, they have to convert them to a lithograph, so it's not a real photograph. But people could see photographs, and so the reality of war begins to sink into the public during the Civil War. Even military art, prior to the Civil War, most of the military art are of commanders. You have lots of pictures of Napoleon, but you don't have any artistic portrayals of soldiers in the battlefield. Again, it's the soldiers come into the pictures. Go ahead. What? I guess we'll get started. Yes. Yeah. Okay. It's time. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? We'll get started with today's topic. Did you know that General Joshua Chamberlain died from his wound, but 50 years later. Not the wound he's actually wounded twice at Gettysburg. Those were minor wounds. He's hit once in his scabbard, leading his charge down Little Round Top. A bullet hits a scabbard, bends the scabbard, and bruises him in the leg. So that's a near wound. And he's also, a bullet grazes his foot. So he's limping at Gettysburg. The wound we're going to talk about today is the wound that occurs a year later at Petersburg. I'm going to try and master this thing again here. Last week I had problems with it, but I won't be using the pointer today, so hopefully I won't hit the wrong button. This is Professor Chamberlain, an artist's portrayal of Professor Chamberlain. He taught rhetoric at Bowdoin College in Maine. When the Civil War breaks out, he is against slavery right from the beginning. And when the war breaks out, he has just recently signed a contract to teach at Bowdoin. He's been there, but now he's been made a full professor, and he wants to enlist. And the board says, no, you've signed a contract with us as a professor. You're going to teach here. So he says, I've been teaching here a while. I'm due for a sabbatical. And the board says, yes. He had a 1-year sabbatical. So he took the sabbatical and enlisted. So that's how he gets into the war. He's my idea of the classic citizen soldier. Someone not trained in the military who becomes an officer as a volunteer. And I'd like to contrast him with the gentleman we spoke about last week, Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson, the professional soldier, Chamberlain, the citizen soldier. Both were professors. Jackson taught at a military school. Chamberlain taught at a private college. Both will have profound effects on the war. Chamberlain's death has a profound effect on not only Lee's army, but also indirectly on the Union Army. Chamberlain will survive his wound, and he will have a profound effect on both armies, in particular at Appomattox. Jackson should have survived his wound. Chamberlain should have died of his wound, and it'd be just the opposite. So they're fun to compare. This is an artist's representation of Chamberlain, the soldier. If I'm going to talk about Chamberlain, I'm going to talk a little bit, very little, about second day Gettysburg, July 2nd, and Chamberlain's involvement that day. Lee had planned an attack on the Union line up the Emmitsburg Pike. But General Hood, who is commanding one of Longstreet's divisions, is wounded very early in the attack, and Hood has not passed on information to his subcommanders as to what they're supposed to do. That is, march up this is going to be a flank attack on the Union line coming up the Emmitsburg Road. And Longstreet comments that as he passes Little Round Top Mountain, that if the Union has forces up there, they will hit me in my right flank as my men march in line, a battle line past Little Round Top. And Lee's response to that is, yes, but you will only be in range for a short period of time. So the attack, Lee's plan is not to attack Little Round Top. But Dan Sickles has moved Third Corps forward into the Peach Orchard. Hood is wounded early, and when Union troops are seen in the Peach Orchard,
his sub-commanders move in that direction because fire is coming from the Peach Orchard and from Devil's Den. So the attack on Little Round Top is not part of Lee's plan, but it occurs on second day. Strong Vincent's brigade, a small brigade, is brought to fortify the top of Little Round Top. Little Round Top, if you go there today, has a lot of trees on it. It's nice and forested. At the time of the Civil War, there were very few trees on it, so it was basically a pretty much bare mountain, a mountaintop. But it's not particularly high. It's the bigger hill is Big Round Top next to it, which was really not fortified. Hood's Texas Brigade will strike along with Alabama forces, Strong Vincent's forces. Chamberlain is the end of the Union line. And if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, or if you read the book Killer Angels, Strong Vincent, in positioning his men, tells Chamberlain, "You are the end of the Union line. If you go," that is, if Chamberlain's position is compromised, the whole Union line potentially is compromised. So this is what Chamberlain has in mind when he defends Little Round Top. The attack on Little Round Top begins about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there are at least 6 or 7 successive waves of Confederates moving uphill against the Chamberlain's position. And Chamberlain is running low on men and running low on ammunition, and the Confederates in the meantime keep moving to their right to try and get around Chamberlain. And Chamberlain initially tries to block that by so-called refusing the line. Refusing the line means you take the end of your line and you bend it back at a right angle. So the 20th Maine position is like an L in this position. By refusing the line, to get around him, the Confederates have to go further uphill and further to the right to try and get around him. So refusing your line is a defensive maneuver to force the enemy to try and extend further to get around you. At this point, he's running out of ammunition, and he comes up with the concept of a charge, and he orders a bayonet charge. His men are low on ammunition, and he will use the angle point of the L, which is where his color guard is anchored, as the hinge point, and as he says in the movie and he says in the book, like a swinging gate. So the now I think I will try the. Yeah, there we go. This end of the line here will swing around and charge around, and then the rest of the 20th Maine, they'll charge across in this direction. The Confederates have not had water all day long. They've been unsuccessful in their attempts multiple times to break the Union line there. And when Chamberlain's charge occurs, their attack disintegrates. And the 20th Maine will capture about 200 Confederates as they charge down, even though many of them have no ammunition left. So that's the key point in the movie and in the book, where Chamberlain is recognized. In the historical novel Killer Angels by Michael Shera, Chamberlain orders that desperate charge and is successful in finally breaking the will of the Alabamans assaulting his left flank. In the book, his favorite sergeant, Buster Kilrain, is wounded a second time in the arm. And at the end of the charge, Chamberlain seeks out his favorite sergeant. This is Don Troiani's artistic representation of Chamberlain's charge. And I'm going to read what's in the book. Buster, how you doing, you old Mick? And how are you, Colonel Darlin, this fine day? Chamberlain says to Tozier, the color sergeant who was administering aid to Buster, how is that? Tozier shrugged. It's an arm. By God, Chamberlain said, I think you'll live. Kilrain blinked hazily. Only an arm. Got to lose something. Might's well be an arm. Can part with that easier than the other mechanics of nature, and that's the truth. He was blurring. He stretched his eyes. Used to worry about that, you know. Only thing ever worried, really. Losing wrong part. His eyes closed. His voice was plaintive. Now, at a Civil War Remembrance Day in Schenectady at Proctor's Theater in 1996, this is shortly after the movie came out, we had a showing of the movie there, and we invited Jeff Shera, Michael Shera's son, to introduce the movie. And it was at that performance that Michael said that his father, Jeff said his father made Buster Kilrain the only major fictional character in the book, and that Buster Kilrain was Michael Shera himself. Shera had kind of rediscovered Chamberlain. Chamberlain was well known up to the point of his death in 1913, and for years after, a few years afterwards. But then he gets lost to history. But Michael Shera had rediscovered Chamberlain in the 50s, and he researched Chamberlain, and he writes the Killer Angels primarily around Chamberlain. And he was fascinated by Chamberlain, and he wanted to be able to interview Chamberlain himself. And the only way he could interview Chamberlain himself was to write himself into the book as Buster Kilrain, a sergeant, whom Chamberlain and Kilrain have discussions about why men fight in the Civil War and what they were fighting for. And Kilrain is he's an Irish immigrant. He's fled Ireland because of the potato famine in the 50s and what the British were doing in Ireland. And he had been a fighter in Ireland. And he came to the United States, and he's fighting for a different, what he thinks is a different reason than why Chamberlain is fighting in the Civil War. And they get into discussions about men. And Chamberlain makes the comment that he thinks there's some good in all men. And the topic comes to angels. And Kilrain says, if there be angels in men, they must be killer angels. And that's where the title of the book comes from. Knowing that Kilrain was in fact Michael Shera himself, I can't help but feel that Kilrain's comments were intentionally prophetic for Chamberlain. For a year later, Chamberlain will suffer the wound that Kilrain was worried about. And I think Michael Shera was planning on writing another book, a sequel to it, which his son will ultimately write. I think Michael knew what was going to happen to Chamberlain because he had read about Chamberlain, and so he introduces that through Kilrain. Now, after Gettysburg in August of 1863, General Charles Griffin is insistent with Washington that Chamberlain be given command of the 3rd Brigade in the 1st Division of the 5th Corps. This had been Strong Vincent's brigade at Gettysburg and included the 20th Maine that Chamberlain had commanded at the point. Strong Vincent is mortally wounded at Gettysburg on 2nd day. So Griffin wants to make, oops, I thought I had Griffin, no I don't, wants to make Chamberlain head of that brigade. Griffin once said that what made Chamberlain an excellent officer was his, quote, his absolute indifference to danger, unquote. At Rappahannock Station after Gettysburg, Chamberlain's luck would hold out and his horse would take a bullet meant for him. Later that fall, he had a relapse of malaria and was ill enough that he was transported unconscious in a cattle car back to Washington. He recovered in Washington at one of the hospitals. He was assigned to court-martial duty. But after the Battle of the Wilderness, this is now 1864, in May, he was distraught and was determined to return to the battlefield. On May 9th, he wrote to Adjutant General Townsend, quote, "My health will now, in my opinion, permit my resuming active duty, and never before having been absent from my command in time of an active campaign, my anxiety to be on the battlefield is very great," unquote. In the second week of May, he was allowed to rejoin the 20th Maine as colonel during the fighting at Spotsylvania, which was a bloody fighting, but the 20th Maine was not particularly involved in much of that fighting. Over the next several weeks after Spotsylvania, he intermittently commanded the 3rd Brigade in the 1st Division when its commander, Joseph Bartlett, was incapacitated with arthritis. At the North Anna River, Chamberlain was almost captured while leading his men. In late May, he was inspecting the picket line and by accident wandered into the Confederate lines, but he bluffed his way out, assuming a Southern accent and passing himself off as a Confederate officer in the dusk. But Griffin felt it was his handling of changing conditions on the battlefield that earned him high praise from his commander Bartlett, who then referred that praise to Griffin. During the first week of June in 1864, General Warren would take command of the 5th Corps, and he rearranged his 5th Corps. And Warren will give Chamberlain command of a new brigade in Griffin's 1st Division. Chamberlain will now command the 1st Brigade, nicknamed the Keystone Brigade because it consisted of 6 Pennsylvania regiments. 5 of the regiments were veteran regiments from the old 1st Corps, which we talked about when we talked about Doubleday at Gettysburg. And that included the 121st, the 142nd, the 143rd, 149th, and 150th Pennsylvania regiments. They had been, remember, after Gettysburg, 1st Corps was so decimated that it was dissolved, and those regiments were assigned to a 4th Division in the 5th Corps during the reorganization of the Army of the Potomac. But now those 5 were removed from the 4th Division, put together as a brigade, and they were reinforced with a brand new brigade from Pennsylvania, the 187th, which was a full 1,000-man brigade. And the number of men in that brigade outnumbered the total number of men in the 5 veteran brigades. I'm going to stop here a minute and just say comment that the Union Army, rather than most brigades started out as 1,000-man brigades, but with battle casualties and illness, they got smaller and smaller. Rather than expand a brigade, the Union Army tended to form a new brigade and reinforce existing units. In the Confederate Army, rather than forming new brigades, just would add more, restore men to that same brigade. So the number of brigades in the Confederate Army are a lot smaller in numbers, in absolute numbers, than in the Union Army. And those brigades were huge. So a brigade in the Confederate Army might be the size of a division in the Union Army. That's part of the. If you read anything about units, you say, well, how come 187 regiments? Boy, that's a lot of men, regiments on the field from Pennsylvania alone. It's because the other regiments were about anywhere from 200 to 300 men at most. So anyway, now my one connection to Chamberlain is through the 187th Regiment. My wife's great-great-grandfather actually winds up commanding the 187th in the Keystone Brigade. So, that's my only connection to Chamberlain, through my wife's side of the family. Headquarters in Washington had not yet responded to General Warren's repeated request for a promotion in grade for Chamberlain, so he commanded the brigade at the rank and pay of a colonel. In the first weeks of June, Chamberlain found that he could not fight off a nagging feeling that he would be wounded in the abdomen. He will write after the war. He will write a book that never gets. It wasn't published during his lifetime. It will be published. I think it was in the 1970s. It's a thin monograph about the Battle of his involvement in the Battle of Petersburg, and this is where he writes this. This was a new feeling for him because he had never felt anything like that, and he dealt with it by taking the blanket roll, which was usually on the back of the saddle on his horse, and he puts the blanket roll and attaches it to the front of the saddle, realizing that it's not going to stop a mini ball, but it provided him with at least some comfort that he had done something to deal with this particular feeling. On June 12th, Grant made his move from Cold Harbor across the James River towards Petersburg. At Cold Harbor, Grant's forces will suffer about 5,000 casualties in a matter of 15 minutes, attacking a good defensive line that Lee had set up. And after Cold Harbor, which Grant feels was one of the biggest mistakes he made, attacking a fortified position at that time, Lee is convinced that Grant is going to move to Richmond as the target. But Grant will outthink Lee, and Grant will set up a 1,000-foot-long pontoon bridge across the James River and will move the army across the James River. And his plan is to attack Petersburg, which is the supply link for Richmond. Lee is not convinced that Grant is really going towards Richmond, so Lee will stay in place in his defensive positions around Cold Harbor, defending Richmond. The plan was for a Union assault against the Petersburg line on the 17th of June. Petersburg is defended by minimal forces at this point. So it's planned, the attack on the Confederate line is expected to be successful. But because Meade could not get his forces into position before the attack on the 17th, he postpones the attack until the 18th. On the night of the 17th, Chamberlain had another unusual foreboding feeling. As he writes, something said, "You will not be here again. This will be your last." As this feeling became more oppressive, he went out to speak to his close friends. He turned his cheerful good evening greetings into goodbyes. Finally, he went to General Griffin to thank him for his kindnesses. Griffin accepted the compliment, but suggested Chamberlain go to sleep because he looked worn out. This is the conversation that Chamberlain writes. "General, this is my last night with you. You must let me thank you." "What do you mean?" Griffin replies. "I shall fall tomorrow, General. This is my goodbye." "Why do you think so?" "The Dark Angel has said it to me. You have lost your poise. These terrible strains have been too much for you." "No, General. I have perfect balance. You will see that. You will not be ashamed of me." "My God, you are all wrong. I will tell you now what I am going to do. Warren and I have been talking things over. It is decided. You have done your full share of fighting. You are not to be put in tomorrow. You are to be held in reserve. So there." "Yes, General. The reserve goes in when all is lost or must be saved by sacrifice. Let me lead tomorrow. Drop this. Put away this feeling. We can't spare you, and I will not let you be exposed tomorrow. Go to sleep. We will talk about this in the morning if there's anything to talk about." End quote. Early on the 18th, Lee first reinforcements, Kershaw's division, arrived at Petersburg and went into line. Lee has now realized that Chamberlain has moved to Petersburg. 2 hours later, Field's division arrived and goes into line. Meade still believed that the defenders of Petersburg had not had time to strengthen their defenses or be reinforced. When his corps commanders had not been ready on the 17th for the simultaneous attack, he had postponed to the 18th. So Meade is going to attack on the 18th, but he's going to attack a reinforced line now. In the fighting that takes place on the 18th, Union attacks will be uncoordinated. A Confederate battery situated several hundred yards south of the Confederates' main works on fortified high ground called Reeves Salient harassed the 5th Corps assault. This is Chamberlain's personal map of the battlefield. This is Fort Mahone, a Confederate fort, will later be renamed Fort Damnation by the Union forces. This is the Confederate line, their trench line running like this. This is Reeves Salient. This is this piece of high ground here where the Confederate battery is located. The Union line is back here, and this is Fort Sedgwick, which really hasn't come into existence yet. This is just a fortified position. This will be this will become a Union fort. Griffin and Warren rode up to Chamberlain, and Griffin spoke. It is too bad. I tried to prevent this, but those batteries out there must be dislodged. General Warren asks if you will do it. Chamberlain accepted the task. The brigade moved through a pine area and then charged. Chamberlain's horse was shot out from underneath him by case-shot artillery fire, but the brigade managed to drive back the Confederate battery at that location. The salient itself was protected by ravines and deep railroad cuts, in addition to that large earthen fort, Fort Mahone. It was situated so that its artillery could cover the open ground in front of Reeves Salient. Chamberlain ordered his brigade to dig in on the reverse slope of the hill that they had just taken, and he waited for artillery to reinforce his position. Up came the 1st New York Heavy Artillery, the 15th New York Artillery, and Bigelow's 9th Massachusetts Artillery. A staff officer rode up with orders for Chamberlain to continue his attack on the main works in front of him. Chamberlain was 1 mile in advance of the main Union line, and he was isolated. Crossfire and enfilade fire would sweep the brigade as its soldiers tried to rush forward into the swampy ground in front of the enemy's works. He did not know the officer who relayed the orders to him, so risking rank and career, Chamberlain sent a note back to commanding General Meade, noting that, quote, circumstances lead me to believe the general cannot be perfectly aware of my situation, which has greatly changed within the last hour. My men would be held at a great disadvantage under a destructive fire, and that it is my opinion that if an assault is to be made, it should be made by nothing less than the whole army. There were 23 cannons to oppose his advance, 7 enfilading cannons for Fort Mahone in addition to them. They were just 400 yards to the brigade's left. In a half an hour, the orderly returned. Quote, the general says, you are quite right in what you say about the assault. The whole army will attack, but you being advanced as you are, it will be necessary to guide on you. You will be the battalion of direction. In other words, you will be the lead in the charge. Chamberlain sent the reply back, I will attack precisely at 3 o'clock. So by other units in 5th Corps. Chamberlain met with his 2 colonels and gave particular instructions, especially to the 2 senior colonels likely to succeed him. Chamberlain placed his brigade in 2 ranks, with 3 veteran regiments in front and the large new regiment as the 2nd rank, and 2 regiments to protect his left flank. At 3 o'clock, the bugler sounded charge, and the regiments topped the crest of the hill and headed down the slope. They were within long musket range and case-shot artillery fire. The support on the left never materialized, as Cutler's 4th Division didn't receive their orders about Chamberlain's attack until 3 p.m. itself, and they would go into action 30 minutes after Chamberlain had started his assault. Deep railroad cuts on the right made it unlikely that a Confederate counterattack would come from that side. Chamberlain was leading his brigade. His color bearer was killed, and Chamberlain picked up the triangular flag with the Maltese cross on it. That's the emblem for the 5th Corps. As the brigade got closer to the enemy's lines, the Confederate artillery could no longer be depressed enough, easing the fire on the Federals. The swampy ground, however, slowed his men. Spying an easier way through the swampy ground, Chamberlain leapt over a small stream, turned his right side to the enemy, and motioned with his saber for his men to oblique to the left. So this is Joe Humboldt's artistic portrayal of Chamberlain at that moment. On one of our tours, we had a chance to actually, this stream is still here, or you can see it's really not much of a stream at all, but it sits in the middle of development. This is the Confederate perspective from Fort Mahone, looking at Chamberlain's position. This is why I'm particularly interested in preserving battlefields. Chamberlain said he felt, quote, a sharp, hot flash that cut to my backbone, unquote. He later would recall that he first feared he had been shot in the middle of the back, below the belt, as if he had been fleeing the enemy. What would his family think, especially his mother, when they heard that he had died with a back wound? Afraid that if he fell and his men would lose heart for the charge or halt to help him, Chamberlain jabbed the point of his saber into the ground before him as a makeshift cane and held the flagstaff in the other hand. He continued to stand rigid as the men broke ranks around him. Then he felt a gush of hot blood in his sword hand, and he looked down, and for the first time he saw blood spurting out of his right side. Now he realized he had been hit in the hip, and he later noted that he was relieved that he was not shot in the back. Blood from his wound ran down the inside of his pant legs and filled his long cavalry boots to overflowing. He sank to the ground first on one knee, and then fell on the ground in a heap in an ever-enlarging pool of blood for the next hour. 50 years later, he would sanguinely remark, "I am not of Virginia blood. She is of mine." It's been almost universally speculated that a mini ball, probably aimed too low, may have ricocheted upward from the ground and struck Chamberlain in the low side of his right hip, just in front of the hip bone. Now, surgeons of the day had noted that internal human organs tended to literally tear themselves apart from a mini ball's path. The bullet also would tumble when it hit an object and deform. The medical report stated that the bullet had struck Chamberlain, quote, in the right hip, in front of and a little below the right trochanter major, passed diagonally backwards, and made an exit above and posteriorly to the left greater trochanter. The bladder was involved in the wound at some portion, as the subsequent history of escape of urine from the tract of the wound and its extravasation testified, unquote. Now, translating, the ball hit just in front of the right hip bone, splintered some of the bone, passed through his lower abdomen, traveling diagonally backwards and upwards, nicking the bladder, neck at the urethra, and doing a great deal of damage inside, more so than the entrance wound would indicate. It fractured the left pelvic bone and came to rest just under the skin at Chamberlain's other hip, behind the hip bone. The shock wave of the ball passing close to the left sciatic nerve probably accounted for the back pain. So this is the course of the bullet, supposedly ricocheting and angling upward and backwards. These are slices. These are anatomical slices in the frontal plane. The round circles would be the ball of the hip joint. This is an MRI of a human body with slices taken every 3 millimeters and stored in a computer that I had access to at my old medical school that they had put in, where you could then manipulate it in any plane that you want. You couldn't trace the path of this bullet on the human cadaver slices because they were always sliced at a right angle. But with the computer model, you can slice at oblique angles. So this would be the course of the bullet passing in. Oops. Go back to that one. Yep. Here we go. Passing in front of the right hip, through the pelvis, and we'll see some bony pictures of the pelvis, and behind the left hip. Again, up at an upward angle and going from front to back. This is a drawing from the side, directly from the right side. This would be the bullet here, just grazing the right femur. Basically going through the prostrate, partially severing the urethra from the bladder neck. Now this is the bone portion of the pelvis. Again, this is the trochanter major. It's a point where muscles attach. So below that, grazing the bone, passing through the large opening in the pelvis here through which muscle bundles come, but also the femoral artery, the femoral vein, and femoral nerve come through there. The bullet misses those structures and passes through the pelvis to the opposite side. So this is again another through this large opening in the pelvis through which muscle and vascular and nerve structures come. And this is those nerve structures and vessels in place. So it passes in front of, oops, try that again. In front of the femoral vein, this is the main vein returning blood from the leg, the femoral artery, the main supply to the leg, and the femoral nerve here. So it passes right over the top of these through the pelvis, missing those vital structures. Another angled view, another angled bony view. Now, I personally don't believe this was a ricocheted bullet, and I think Joe Umbel, in his drawing, in his painting, puts Chamberlain in the perfect position for this wound. Oops. I've added the white line here, the path of the bullet. Because his right leg is higher, because he's going upslope, this is a bullet fired from a Confederate position that would take that course. When you take Chamberlain, if you stood him upright after the bullet passed through him, because the left leg is lower, in the drawing and probably the way Chamberlain was in that position when he was actually hit, when you put him level, the bullet will look like it's going from low to up, from right to left at an upward angle. It seemed unlikely that a bullet was going to ricochet off muddy ground to strike Chamberlain in that manner. Now, when Chamberlain went down, his men passed around him. Lieutenants West Funk and Benjamin Walters rushed to his aid and managed to carry him to a slightly safer position. He was still coherent, and his mind was still on the battle. He ordered one of the lieutenants to tell the senior colonel to take over command of the brigade, and the other to get support for Bigelow's 9th Massachusetts Battery for the anticipated countercharge by the Confederates. He lay on the battlefield for an hour under artillery and gunfire. When Bigelow found out that Chamberlain had been wounded, he sent some of his artillerists out to retrieve him. Thinking that he was dying, Chamberlain tried to direct the gunners to go after more hopeful cases that lay scattered on the field. The gunners, however, had their orders. Within seconds after moving him, a shell landed where he had lain, splattering everyone with mud. The bearers moved him again, and a nearby shell burst blew the arm off one of the stretcher bearers, kind of like reminiscent of Jackson last week with his stretcher bearer having an arm blown off. Finally, Chamberlain was brought behind Bigelow's battery. Some portions of his brigade were unable to pull back until about 3 a.m. the next day. Chamberlain was taken to a field hospital where doctors Robert Everett from the 16th Michigan and William DeWitt from an unknown Pennsylvania regiment examined the wound and packed it with a ramrod, put lint in basically to staunch the bleeding, but they saw no chance of recovery. While the surgeons debated whether they should tell Chamberlain, the colonel himself said to them, "I know all about it. You have done your best. It is a mortal wound. I know this, and I am prepared for it. I have been for a long time." When word of the wounding reached brother Tom Chamberlain, Tom was a captain in one of the regiments in the brigade, he sought out and brought along Dr. Abner Shaw, who was the physician for the 20th Maine, and Dr. Morris Townsend from the 44th New York. Both were talented surgeons. Shaw had been a good friend of Chamberlain. For the next 12 hours, with limited anesthesia and no blood or fluid replacement possible, the two surgeons removed the mini ball, ligated and repaired vessels, cleaned debris from the wound, sewed up the bladder, reconnected the severed urethra, and packed the track of the bullet. Now, how do they do that? Well, the Surgical and Medical History of the War of the Rebellion, which is a 50-pound, 8-volume set of many of the injuries. Chamberlain is in that, but Shaw, I think, intentionally did not submit any significant medical records to be published for his concern over Chamberlain. All that is in under JLC, pelvic wound, is one line that says too long use of a brass catheter resulted in a fistula. And that's the extent of his wound. Tom Desjardins is an author who lives in Maine, who has written a couple of books about Chamberlain, and he's actually discovered Chamberlain's monograph about his Petersburg wounding. I suspect that Desjardins had become friends with the Shaw family. where the doctor's records still exist. Chamberlain's records have never been published before, or published to date. I have all the Civil War roundtables in Vermont once a year have a combined meeting in Montpelier, and they usually have a guest speaker. So one year it was Tom Desjardins. So I was living in Albany at that point. So a number of us from my Northern Civil War roundtable went up to hear Tom talk. And then afterwards, Montpelier is the capital of Vermont with one traffic light in the city. And we stayed at the hotel where the meeting was held overnight because it was a long trip back to Albany. So we stayed overnight. And of course, after the meeting, we went to the bar across the street from the hotel and got talking about Chamberlain's wound. And that's where I learned from Tom that halfway through the operation, after they reconnected it, Chamberlain's bladder is full and he's in great discomfort with a full bladder. And Desjardins said, in order to evacuate the bladder, a small stab wound was made at the base of the shaft of the penis, and a glass catheter was passed through that wound directly into the bladder to evacuate the bladder. Now, for him to say that, he must have seen Shaw's records. But that's all I got out of Tom as the nature of this wound. And I suspect the approach would be similar to a cesarean section. The cesarean section had been used in obstetrics for probably at this point at least several hundred years. Initially to get a baby out for a mother who was dying, but later on to deliver a baby that could not pass through the birth canal. So the approach would be similar to a cesarean section, I believe. Halfway through the operation, the pain became sheer torture despite the recurrent doses of anesthesia, and the two surgeons laid down their instruments thinking that the agony had gone on long enough. But Chamberlain himself encouraged them to continue, although all three had little hope for recovery. Generals Warren and Griffin looked in on Chamberlain and sent word to Meade and Ulysses S. Grant, requesting a promotion to brigadier general for the dying officer. Grant did so immediately. He later told Chamberlain that he had never made a promotion on the battlefield before, making this Grant's first battlefield promotion. But Grant had forgotten that several weeks earlier at Spotsylvania, he had done the same for Colonel Emory Upton, who was made a brigadier general on the field. But Grant will later write, Colonel J.L. Chamberlain of the 20th Maine was wounded on the 18th. He was gallantly leading his brigade at the time, as he had been in the habit of doing in all the engagements in which he had previously been engaged. He had several times been recommended for a brigadier generalcy, but for gallant and meritorious conduct. On this occasion, I promoted him on the spot, unquote. On the 19th, one last. If you visit Chamberlain's house in Maine, the bullet is there. This is what the bullet looks like now. You can see the deformation of the bullet. On the 19th, Chamberlain was transported the 16 miles to City Point on the James River by stretcher and 8 bearers because it was less jostling a ride than in a wheeled ambulance. From there, he was taken by ship to the Naval Hospital at Annapolis. He arrived there, in the words of the surgeon, quote, booted and spurred, blood-soaked and smeared, hair and beard matted with blood and earth, pale as death and weak as water, unquote. Chamberlain wrote a poignant farewell letter to his wife. My darling wife, I am lying mortally wounded, the doctors think, but my mind and heart are at peace. Jesus Christ is my all-sufficient Savior. I go to him. God bless and keep and comfort you, precious one. You have been a precious wife to me. To know and love you makes life and death beautiful. Cherish the angels and give my love to all the dear ones. Do not grieve too much for me. We shall all soon meet. Live for the children. Give my dearest love to Father, Mother, and Sally and John. Oh, how happy to feel yourself forgiven. God bless you evermore, precious, precious one. Ever yours, Lawrence. His obituary was reported in the New York papers, but for 6 weeks he lay critically ill with severe fever. After repeated uses of a brass indwelling catheter, pressure necrosis resulted in the formation of a fistula, creating an abnormal communication in the bottom side of the shaft of the penis. A friend reported, quote, "By no artificial means can all the urine be conducted from the bladder without some of it escaping and passing out through the wounds at the opening, which is on the right side of the right leg, 2 inches below the hip joint. It is feared that ulcers will form in the abdomen and terminate his life," unquote. But then, to everyone's surprise, he slowly began to recover. In September, he returned to his home in Maine, and incredibly, on November 18th, 1864, 5 months to the day after his wounding, he returned to active duty in the field. Despite the fact that he was in continued pain and discomfort and could barely walk 100 yards or mount a horse alone. In December, his brigade conducted a raid on the Weldon Railroad. By January 1865, because he had not yet completely recovered from his wound, he was sent to Philadelphia for additional surgery by Dr. Pancoast, one of the most skilled surgeons in the United States at that time. After his surgical stay, Chamberlain could walk and ride. Despite the request of his wife and parents to become a civilian again, he continued with the Army of the Potomac in February of 1865. And he writes a letter to his parents. "I owe the country 3 years of service. It is a time when every man should stand by his guns. And I am not scared or hurt enough yet to be willing to face the rear when other men are marching to the front. It is true my incomplete recovery from my wounds would make a more quiet life desirable. And when I think of my young, independent family, the whole strength of that motive to make the most of my life comes over me. But there is no promise of life in peace and no decree of death in war. And I am so confident of the sincerity of my motives that I can trust my own life and the welfare of my family in the hands of Providence." One of the books written about Chamberlain has that title, The Hands of Providence. It's an interesting book to read. On March 29th, On March 29th, while leading a charge on horseback on the Quaker Road, he received another wound. A Confederate sharpshooter aimed at his chest, but at the instant of firing, Chamberlain's horse reared its head. The bullet passed through the large neck muscle of the horse, riddled the left bridle arm to the elbow, passed through a leather case of field orders and a brass-mounted hand mirror in his breast pocket, struck the chest wall just below the heart, ricocheted off the ribs, ran underneath the skin around the rib, and exited at the back seam of his coat. Struck the holstered pistol of his aide who was riding alongside and behind him, and knocking the man out of his saddle. Now, when you think of the course of that bullet, and you look at the Kennedy bullet, I think they're probably similar type of thing. Chamberlain briefly lost consciousness, then recovered, and covered in his own blood and his horse's blood, rallied his regiments. He was cheered not only by his own men, but also the Confederates as well. And that's what this artist portrays. By now, Confederate soldiers know the mettle of this man that they've been fighting against. and they were glad also that he had not been killed. After driving the enemy from the woods and trenches, he walked the battlefield speaking to the wounded. He met wounded General Sakell, who remarked to Chamberlain, "You have the soul of a lion and the heart of a woman." And that's another title of another book written about Chamberlain, The Soul of a Lion. For his bravery in action on Quaker Road, he received the Brevet Commission of Major General. In the final months of the war, during the final campaign against Lee's army, Chamberlain had continued to conspicuously lead his men. He was given the singular honor of accepting the surrender of Lee's army's weapons and battle flags. Different artists' depictions of Chamberlain at Appomattox. Grant says that he appointed a three-man commission to select an officer to receive the surrender of Lee's weapons and battle flags. I don't believe Grant. I believe Grant gave that order, but Grant privately told the three officers, "I want Chamberlain to do it." A regular Army officer, Corps commander, could have been selected for this. But Chamberlain, I think Grant knew. I see Grant's writing, despite what the official order says. I see Grant's writing all over this, so to speak. Grant also knew the mettle of the man, and Grant knew that Chamberlain would handle the surrender appropriately. And this is what he did. He lined his division up on both sides of the road leading up to the courthouse at Appomattox. Instead of a humiliating experience for the Confederate soldiers with jeering, Chamberlain's troops were silent. When the Confederate column came up, Chamberlain instructed his lines to shift from order arms to carry arms as a mark of respect for the defeated men that they had been fighting for almost 3 years. His salute to Confederate General Gordon's troops was gallant and began the healing process for many soldiers on both armies, as noted in their letters and diaries. Quote from one of Chamberlain's books. General Gordon, at the head of the marching column, outdoes us in courtesy. He was riding with downcast eyes and more than pensive look. But at this clatter of arms, he raises his eyes and, instantly catching the significance, wheels his horse with that superb grace of which he is a master, drops the point of the sword to his stirrup, gives a command at which the great Confederate ensign following him is dipped, and his decimated brigades, as they reach our side, respond to the carry. I think that's why Grant chose Chamberlain to receive Lee's commands, Lee's flags. After leaving the Army in January 1866, he threw himself into politics, education, and land speculation in Florida. He was governor of Maine for 2 terms. He became president of Bowdoin College after having taught every course at Bowdoin College. He invested in orange groves in Tampa and lost considerable wealth in that. He also suffered a midlife crisis. The pain of his wounds became more intense, and was constant in both hips and in the urethral fistula. He became estranged from his wife and family, and his sexual relationships with his wife were jeopardized. In 1892, his wife went with their children to New York City. In New York City, a number of wealthy men had purchased a hotel, and this hotel was available for the wives of widows of Union officers if they came to the city for their to visit and stay. And his wife Fanny went to that hotel. By chance, I gave this talk at an event in the Schoharie Valley, and a couple came up to me afterwards, and they had been doing research on a family in New York City, their family in New York City, and had at the New York Public Library, and had come across the sign-in log for the hotel, and they were just going through it, and they found Mrs. Chamberlain's entry, and she writes, Fanny Chamberlain, wife of I think it was written dead husband, something like that. So Chamberlain was in 1892 was dead to her, and so she stayed at this hotel as the widow of General Joshua Chamberlain. The relationship will be reestablished. She will develop what I believe was probably retinitis pigmentosa, and will become blind in later life. So, and he will take care of his wife for the last 7 or 8 years of her life. She will predecease him by about 8 years. There were recurrent urinary tract infections and periodic malaria attacks with long convalescent periods. He always disliked using opiates, so he bore his pain with stoicism. He felt that there was a purpose to his pain. The country had been delivered. This was the victory of good over evil, and his daily pain was the price for part of that victory. In April of 1883, he nearly died when he had an abscess drained and underwent another unsuccessful attempt at reconstructive surgery in Boston at the Massachusetts General Hospital. It was rumored that he had to wear diapers because of urinary dribbling from his fistula. Later, he continued to have flare-ups of what he called his war tokens, during which times his lower abdomen, bladder, and testicles were chronically swollen and tender. In February of 1893, he applied for a $20 increase in his $30 per month government pension, but despite indisputable medical evidence, the Pension Bureau turned him down. Chamberlain always maintained his military ties and was active in veteran affairs. He undertook a final journey to Gettysburg in May of 1913. His old friend Abner Shaw accompanied him. Towards the end of November, he again fell seriously ill. By year's end, the final crisis appeared to be at hand. But in early January, he surprised Shaw and rallied. But just when Shaw felt Chamberlain had beaten the odds one more time, he had another violent relapse. Chamberlain died of complications of the Petersburg wound in the forenoon of a bitterly cold February 24th, 1914, just 4 months short of 50 years after that musket ball had whistled through him from hip to hip. The war had claimed him at last. This is his death certificate. He's buried in Maine, near Bowdoin College. This is his stone. And that's a picture of the catheter. That's the only thing in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. Nowadays, the cause of such an injury is usually the result of an auto accident with a rupture of the bladder neck and urethra. The treatment is similar, primary repair with use of a catheter. The results are often the same, with need for repeat surgeries. In the pre-antibiotic era, mortality would be about 50%. Strong Vincent had actually suffered a similar wound at Little Round Top and had died one day after the battle. One of the two fatalities in the 1998 deer hunting season in New York State was a similar wound, and that patient died in the operating room despite modern medicine, cardiovascular drugs, and blood replacement. In Chamberlain's case, several assumptions can be made about the bullet's path. An injury to the rectum or iliac vessels would have been fatal. He was able to walk after his recovery, so the bullet did not damage either sciatic nerve. Catheters were necessary for urinary drainage, and Chamberlain's case, as I said, was discussed in just that one or two sentences in the history of the surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. 4 additional surgeries he underwent in 1865, 1866, 1883, and 1893 were primarily to close the fistula, and all were unsuccessful. But because of the nerves in the area that the bullet passed through, small nerves, the damage to the neuromuscular and neurovascular network would have left Chamberlain with constant dribbling of urine and impotence. Viagra would not have been particularly useful here. Bladder, prostatic, testicular, and urethral infections were recurrent in him, eventually leading to overwhelming sepsis and death. His death certificate listed the cause of death as chronic cystitis and chronic posterior urethritis caused originally by gunshot wound. The inspiration, camaraderie, and exhilaration he had felt on the battlefield eluded him in later life after he left the Army. At the dedication of the 20th Maine Monument on Little Round Top, he spoke these haunting words which explain why we are here today and why we visit battlefields. Quote, "In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear. But spirits linger to consecrate the ground for the vision place of souls. And reverent men and women from afar, and generations that know us not and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream. And lo, the shadow of a mighty presence shall wrap them in its bosom, and the power of the vision passed into their souls." Unquote. Thank you. Do you have any questions about Chamberlain?
Sure.
You'll forgive me.
I'd like to use that.
I'm a historical reenactor, and I've had the privilege of going to the ceremony at Appomattox. And when we stand there, the Yankee soldiers line up on both sides, and it is very much what they would have done at that time and what Chamberlain would have honored people with. And the Confederate soldiers then march along in between the two of them as they stand on either side of the road. And what happens then is they stack their arms. Please ignore that. They stack their arms, which is a very hard thing for soldiers to do. And then they bring their flag over the top, and the tears are very present, not only in the Confederate reenactors, but in the Yankee reenactors as well. And the flag flies, the Confederate flag flies over their head, and as it goes by, each one get a chance to touch and say goodbye. And it's a very, very moving thing. If you ever get a chance to go to that reenactment, please go. The reverence that's shown to both the soldiers and the men that have fought against each other. And if you ever get a chance to go to Gettysburg to some of the both reenactments, but to Remembrance Day, it's a very moving and very respectful. And I think Grant and people like Chamberlain had a big part in all of that. Thank you for telling this story.
Thank you. Thank you for telling that. Yeah, I was there for the 150th at Appomattox. That was very, very moving. Any other questions that anyone has? We'll have one more talk next Friday. It's going to be on the Orphans of Gettysburg. at the very end, yeah. If you give me your email, I will email that to you. It's in one of Chamberlain's books, but I don't remember which one. Yeah. I think it's either from In the Hands of Providence, that's one, or The Soul of the Lion. About 10 years ago, I don't remember who compiled the book, but it's a book of the love letters of Chamberlain and his wife Fanny write to each other. It's called Fanny and Joshua. Yeah, and it's very nice to read also. So that yes. Yep, very much. There's a story I tell, and I can barely tell it without my voice, my voice cracking. John Hennessy is a historian at. He was at Fredericksburg. I think John is still at Fredericksburg. John's a friend of mine, and we did a tour with him of the Battle of Second Manassas, and the morning we started out on the tour, we did this on Columbus Day weekend. It was a long weekend, and it was foggy and damp that morning, and dense fog. And the bus took us out to the battlefield near Sudley Church, which is at the end of the Confederate line at that point. Sudley Church had been used as a hospital on the battlefield. And then John took us on the hill behind Sudley Church, a small knoll there in the woods. And he said, if you look around, you will see, regular depressions in the ground. He says, soldiers who had died at the hospital were buried on this hill. He says, the bodies aren't there now. The bodies have all been removed and have been placed in cemeteries, but you can still see some of the depressions in the ground. And then John said he had some quotes that he read about soldiers who had fought in the battle there. And the last one he had discovered in a library in Western New York State, the diary of a Union soldier who had been killed in the war. But his diary had been sent back to his family, and his family had donated it to the library. So it was in the town library there, and John had heard about it and went and read it. He said that the diary was like many soldiers' diaries, had just regular daily entries of what was going on, what they had to eat that night, who was ill, and things. Nothing spectacular in it, except the last entry, which had occurred, I guess, several days before he was killed. And he said this entry was unlike all the others in it, and he said it was somehow inspired. And in it, the soldier wrote that should he be killed in the next battle, that he would, should he be killed in the next battle, that the only thing he could leave for his children is the fact that he had died for his country, and no greater gift a prince could leave to their son. As he reads this, the sun comes out through the fog, and we're all standing there, and shafts of light through the fog are hitting the ground where these grave depressions are. And all of us are crying. That's some of the emotion, that you can feel on a battlefield. Like I said, I can't tell that story. Thank you.
Well, this was our last one.
Well, it was on the schedule, but they wanted me to do one more about the orphans of Gettysburg, so we'll have one more next week.
Good. I enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Matt. It was very, very interesting. I appreciate it. And from the medical side, I appreciate all that part of it and understanding that. Thank you for letting me share.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see the man who played Lee at the 150th
150th, where?
at Appomattox?
Yes. Yeah, he looks a lot like me.
That was his last reenactment. He retired after that. And he stood for probably almost 2 hours so that people could shake his hand and take pictures with him. And I know in our collection we have pictures of that. But his graciousness and everything, it was like you would think probably.
Yeah.
It was very special.
We were my roundtable was set up. We were in the
Thank you.
postal tent.
Thank you.
Thank you. We were right out across from the courthouse. The post office was there the first day. The stamp, the Appomattox stamp, was released at that site, and then the Patrick Schroeder, who's the historian at the Appomattox, Patrick's a good friend of ours, and so Patrick allowed us to set up our roundtable right next to the post office there.
Because the courthouse was here and it kind of the road wide around
Yeah,
it came
yeah,
down.
yeah.
And all, and that's where they had the
Yeah.
processional and all. There was a man there that looked like Chamberlain, that was a reenactor. And he was only a colonel or a major, I can't remember. But I was so sorry that they didn't utilize him because he looked so much like Chamberlain. And all, and I kept trying, I couldn't get across the line of men to say something to him. But I'm like, there's Chamberlain, he's right there. You guys see him, and everybody's kind of looking at me funny, like the crazy woman, But
really did. It was amazing.
Yeah, well, you're right. And everyone will be focused on Grant and Lee because
Mhm.
they're the two Army commanders.
Right, yeah, but that man
Yeah.
really did. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Hey, good, good. Good to see you. You got here in time?
Yeah. Just a couple minutes late.
Let me get there. Oh yeah. Did you see there's a big gym down. But beneath us is a track and courts for pickleball. Yeah, and then there are smaller conference rooms, a series of smaller conference rooms. There's a yoga room. Yes, I wore my Gettysburg tie. Yes. No, but